Nothing left of original things. Ottoman heritage in Habsburg Sarajevo. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, the past is a contentious affair, and it has been so for a long time. An Ottoman province from the 15th to the 19th century, the region has witnessed more regime changes than generations over the course of the last century. Turks, Austrians, Hungarians, Croats, and Serbs have quarreled over the region, while the question of its national identity, first raised in the late 19th century, still looms large. Today, Bosnia seeks admission into the European Union, while simultaneously rediscovering its religious, cultural, and historical ties to Turkey. And the question of Bosnian identity, whether it exists at all, what it constitutes, and what it implies, is bound up with interpretations of Bosnia's past. And this is one reason why historians and policymakers today continue to struggle to make sense of it. This challenge of Bosnia's past and heritage is nothing new. Tensions between its integration into the West and its orientalization have shaped its political and cultural life since the region was first conquered by a Western power, and that was in 1878. In that year, Austria-Hungary was given a mandate to occupy and administer the province in the Congress of Berlin, an international convention to settle the Balkan question in the aftermath of the 1875 Russo-Turkish War. And Britain.
I'm sorry, Philip, do you have more than a title slide?
Yes.
So far? Yeah, but we kind of seen the title. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take you.
Yes.
Into Sarajevo.
Yeah.
Okay. In 3 decades after 1878, Austria-Hungary occupied and administered Bosnia-Herzegovina under the nominal suzerainty of the Ottoman Sultan. And the eventual annexation in 1908, a violation of the Treaty of Berlin, sparked an international crisis that almost descended into war. During all this time, the relationship between the Habsburg Empire and its Ottoman antecedents in Bosnia remained uneasy. How were Austro-Hungarian officials to treat the region's Ottoman history? Were they to ignore, reclaim, adapt, or supersede Ottoman heritage? Was Bosnia's Muslim heritage perceived as a threat or a precondition for the region's successful integration into the Habsburg monarchy? Was it opportune to feature or forget the remnants of Ottoman rule in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in its capital Sarajevo in particular? One way to answer these questions, in the absence of official government documents, strategy papers, or pamphlets, is to interpret the architectural history of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The way in which Habsburg officials dealt with the physical legacy of Ottoman rule, mosques, markets, bridges, roads, schools, barracks, hospitals, and reading rooms may reveal more about the changing attitudes towards the region's past than perhaps any other historical source. And nowhere else did these changes manifest themselves more clearly than in Sarajevo, the capital. After the military occupation in 1878, Austria-Hungary embarked on an epic mission of modernization in Sarajevo. The spirit of culture, one newspaper chimed in 1893, lightened the dark, whose ghost disappeared before its magic ray. The holy spirit of European civilization entered victorious. End of quote. Military officials, civil servants, urban planners, hygienists, geometers, and engineers were as busy updating Sarajevo's urban infrastructure as they were disparaging its supposed sloth and stagnation under Ottoman rule.
Philip, sorry.
Yeah.
Is it okay that the still the same picture? I'm not sure.
Yes, it is. It is. In fact, I will just stop the share because there's nothing new coming, so you can see me. You can see me better as I'm speaking.
Okay.
Until the next image arrives. Austria-Hungary built synagogues, Catholic, Protestant churches alongside mosques, constructed market halls, schools, railway stations, and army barracks, electricity plants, sewerage, and a water supply network. They used a major fire of the city in 1879 as a pretext to rebuild Sarajevo's urban center in a rational grid, with straight and widened streets. And they regulated the river Miljacka which runs through Sarajevo with an embankment after the model of European capitals such as Paris, London, and Vienna, concreting in parts of the 17th century bridges, Sarajevo Most and Latinsky Most, remnants of the heydays of Ottoman rule under the Grand Vizier Gazi Husrev Beg. In short, Austro-Hungarian officials had few qualms about intervening radically and boldly in the urban fabric of what used to be an Ottoman city. And within a few decades, the provincial city of Sarajevo was being transformed into a proud regional capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Architects trained in the Western tradition at the art academies of Vienna and Prague replaced local master builders. Students of the Grand Masters of Ringstrasse, Vienna, and ex-employees of some of the monarchy's largest architectural practices, such as Helmer and Fellmer, who built theaters all across Central Europe: Vienna, Brünn, Budapest, Zurich, Berlin, Hamburg, Wiesbaden, Salzburg, Agram, Zagreb, Szegedin, Karlsbad, Sofia, Odessa, Bratislava, to name but a few, designed public buildings and private buildings in Sarajevo, such as Town Hall, the hospital, the officers' mess, the theater, the museums, schools, churches, army barracks, and government offices. And I'll show you once more this impression of Ferhadia, which is one of the major streets of Austro-Hungarian Sarajevo, a miniature Ringstrasse. It's a little model Vienna happening on the banks of the Miljacka. The government and its architects were not unreservedly opposed to acknowledging the city's Muslim past. Quite the opposite, they attempted to add local coloring to the great array of official architecture. Typical of this attempt is the development of an orientalizing style known as pseudo-Moorish and key buildings across Bosnia-Herzegovina. The town hall and law school of Sarajevo, the high school of Mostar, and the train station of Bosanski Brod were all executed in what became known as pseudo-Moorish style.
Philip, excuse me, but
yes,
but we lost your presentation. I'm so sorry. We can see it.
I'll bring it back as soon as.
Okay.
I only have a few. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for shouting out, though. So this pseudo-Moorish style was an attempt to cater to the city's Ottoman past, Muslim past, but it wasn't a historically sensitive style. Its architects, its creators derived inspiration from the Arab world, Egypt, Lebanon, rather than from the architecture of the Ottoman Empire or of Bosnia itself. Nor was it specific to Sarajevo. Across 19th century Europe, we see synagogues, factories, residential buildings displaying a similar orientalizing stylistic language, such as the synagogue in St. Petersburg, for example. So as a result, fin de siècle Sarajevo was beginning to resemble many Central and Western European cities of the time. German-speaking expats, international observers, marveled at its metamorphosis. In a relatively short time span, one journalist wrote in 1895, Sarajevo has seen a degree of progress unrivaled by any city across the monarchy. And we believe not to fall for exaggeration if we predict that Sarajevo will, in not too distant future, have surpassed all cities on the Balkans. Tourists found in Sarajevo all the amenities of a Western metropolis. Quote, the new streets in Sarajevo are designed wide and paved with pavements, shops after European fashion with wide windows, presenting the goods of the Occident, large Viennese coffee houses stocked with all kinds of international newspapers, inviting the leisure seeker, enthused the traveler Heinrich Renner in 1896. While exhorting the accomplishments of Western civilization, such accounts often cast a dark shadow on the city's Ottoman past. The traditional market districts, the mosques and Turkish coffee houses of Sarajevo were often depicted as oriental, backward, insalubrious, and at best folkloristic. Their aim was often to contrast the city's Ottoman past with its superior Western future. After 1900, however, this attitude was beginning to change. Across Europe, contemporaries increasingly regarded the period's predominant architecture as bland, generic, and repetitive. Growing disillusion with the modern metropolis led Western travelers to the Balkans, where they hoped to find towns and villages unspoiled by the advances of civilization. Not untypical was Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, a junior employee in the office of Peter Behrens in Berlin, who in 1911 embarked on a field trip through Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. But even there, he found that Western civilization was beginning to take its toll. There is, summed the future architect Le Corbusier, nothing left of original things. Modernization, he feared, was disseminating, quote, that dreadful virus which goes on ruining those chaste countries, those simple and believing souls, and those artistic cultures that have so far been normal, healthy, and natural. And in 1903, on an official visit, Johannes de Maris Oyens, the Dutch Minister for Industry and Trade, told Sarajevan architect Josip Bankas that if every city soon looked alike, it won't be interesting anymore to travel the world. In the early 20th century, a new generation of architects entered Sarajevo. Like their antecedents in the 1880s and 1890s, they were products of the great academies of the Habsburg monarchy. Unlike their predecessors, however, they imported a new sensitivity towards local architectural heritage. Fueled by the emerging conservation movement, spurred by attempts to preserve and revive architectural traditions through institutions such as the German Heimatschutz League and the Austrian Museums for Arts and Crafts, they discovered in Sarajevo a veritable reservoir of non-academic, non-Western architectural heritage. And this is where the next image is important. Architects such as Josip Pospisil, Rudolf Tönnies, and Ernst Lichtblau, students of Otto Wagner in Vienna, drew inspiration from vernacular Ottoman architecture. Their exquisite sketches reproduced throughout the Habsburg Empire in professional journals and exhibitions, such as this one by Ernst Lichtblau, a sketch from the town of Jajce in Bosnia. In 1911, the architect Josip Bancaš presented the newly elected regional parliament with a motion for a complete listing of the protectable buildings in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was passed unanimously. His colleague Pospisil proposed to install a special commission to assess all planning applications on their effects on the existing Ottoman townscape, an idea adopted from the burgeoning German Heimatschutz League. So one generation after into the occupation, Bosnia's Ottoman heritage appeared no longer subversive or threatening, but worthy of protection. And I think this sketch shows a completely new kind of sensitivity towards the outlines, the picturesque qualities, and in fact, the constructional and historical logic behind Ottoman settlements in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Among Sarajevo's middle classes too, attitudes towards the city's Ottoman past were changing. While in the early years of the occupation, citizens had often enthusiastically welcomed slum clearance, street widening, and the demolition of old city quarters and vernacular timber houses, they now began to recognize aesthetic and cultural value in the city's pre-modern architectural heritage. Symbolic in this regard was the Ottoman market district, Çarşıya. By the turn of the century, the Çarşıya was being encroached by Western-style, multi-story residential developments, which replaced the traditional low-rise timber architecture of workshops and market stalls, caravanserais, courtyards, and mosques. Yet again, wrote one newspaper after forced demolition in 1916, two buildings of old Sarajevo, whose sad architectural constitution did not diminish their originality, and which had enriched the image of the Çarşıya, disappear. If things go on like this, and if no one comes forward to stop the decline of the Çarşıya, Sarajevo will, in a few years, be devoid of its most interesting neighborhood. The city's Ottoman heritage now attracted vigorous interest across society. Planning officials, journalists, amateur historians, travel writers, and civic leaders turned their attention to the streets and buildings that, in their opinion, constituted the real Sarajevo. This was accompanied by a wider movement to preserve and display the Ottoman history of Sarajevo. Institutions such as the Regional Museum, founded in 1885 at the initiative of German-speaking citizens and rehoused in 1913 into a representative building in the city's west, collected folk art, traditional costumes, and archaeological artifacts, while the local official school for arts and crafts, affiliated with the Austrian Museum for Arts and Crafts in Vienna, attempted to revive traditional artisanal techniques such as copperwork, jewelry making, and tapestry. Trying to get to the next slide. Government officials and activists now also demanded that the city's development should, in future, pay tribute to its specific context. Truthfulness to the established character of Sarajevo was now one of their guiding principles. After 1906, a group of architects around Pospisil, Bancac, and Tönnies created a new regionalist architecture or movement, the so-called Bosnian style, Bosanski slog. This movement took cues from the city's traditional Ottoman era architecture, featuring, as you can see in this sketch, timber carvings, overhanging eaves, and irregular asymmetrical plans. It was the first time that new architecture in Habsburg Sarajevo made active reference to the city's Ottoman past. And here you see a villa for a middle-class citizen, a doctor, designed by Hans Berger, who is a Viennese architect and part of this Bosnian style movement. And you can see some delightful irregularity in the facade. You can see the arched windows on the first floor. You can see the heavy rustications on the ground floor, which indeed echoes traditional Ottoman building techniques of having stone on the ground floor and then a timber superstructure, heavy overhanging eaves. So a decidedly regionalist reference. The shift from historicizing and orientalizing styles to the embrace of Ottoman heritage marks an important turning point in the architectural history of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Bosnian style adhered more closely to traditional and supposedly authentic models. At the same time, its creation left architects and planners great artistic license to free themselves from the prescriptive system of grid-based Western academic architectural production. Architectural scholarship has quite rightly honored the Bosnian style as a precursor to post-war modernism in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And indeed, if you imagine this with a flat roof, we get into modernist stylistic language very quickly. But to understand the Bosnian style, we need to locate its development in its political and cultural context. The Bosnian style was neither an inevitable next step in a natural succession of styles, nor did it mean the overcoming of an outdated era of architectural history. What it is that it emerged as a response to concrete political and social realities. Quite generally, the 20th century marked a turning point in the way in which Habsburg Sarajevo interpreted, visualized, and appropriated the city's Ottoman past. It marked a radical break from the cursory or even derogatory treatment of the Ottoman city in the 1880s and 1890s. In the immediate aftermath of the occupation, while the international political and administrative status of Bosnia-Herzegovina was still dynamic, Habsburg officials had shunned engagement with Sarajevo's Ottoman past. Their strategy instead had been, in short, to ignore, and in the medium term, to transform a past that appeared at odds with their accustomed visualization of Habsburg urbanity. Only when the factual integration and the political integration of Bosnia-Herzegovina into the Habsburg Empire was further advanced, were Habsburg citizens able or willing, or both, to reinterpret Sarajevo's Ottoman past in substantially new terms. The new attention on Ottoman past was in itself a product of the new Western regime. Austro-Hungarian architects developed into champions of a new, historically sensitive, stylistic language. Western scientists, archaeologists, cartographers, historians, ethnographers led the rediscovery of the city's pre-modern heritage in many other fields and architecture as well. Their methods and attitudes, their curatorship owed as much to Western intellectual developments as it did to the particular context of the former Ottoman city. The combination of Westernization, modernization, industrialization, and advancing urbanization led contemporaries to reconsider a past that had hitherto been considered oriental, backwards, and parochial as a guiding principle in the development of urban society, identity, culture, and architecture. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Philip. And we have now about 10 minutes maybe for questions and discussions. So I'd rather maybe let our guests to ask questions. You can write them in chat or raise a hand in Zoom, and I will unmute you. Meanwhile, maybe I could start with a question. In your research, you comparing, if I'm not mistaken, you're comparing Strasbourg and Sarajevo, right? Yes. In a larger research that you're working on. Were there any architectural ideas that were transferred from Sarajevo to Strasbourg as a way of as a continuation of this interest in Oriental or new in architecture?
That's a fascinating question, because I'm having to ask this myself all the time. Sarajevo and Strasbourg have in common that they're both capitals of border regions and hotly contested border regions in the long 19th century. And in fact, the story that I told just now about a sort of process of modernization, westernization, standardization, adherence to European models, and then a gradual dissolution from these models and a rediscovery of a regional identity takes place in Strasbourg as well, which gets annexed by the German Empire, but has a peculiar Alsatian identity. And after 1900, a bit like in Sarajevo, this regional identity emerges again in architecture. And what's fascinating about it, of course, is that these things don't happen in isolation, in my view. They're aided by these big developments in Germany. I mentioned the Heimatschutz movement, which is much more than an architectural movement, actually. It's a sort of conservationist movement with regards to culture, art, architecture, society. And I feel that the rhetoric that these movements, these early modernist movements after 1900 transport to these cities helps citizens locally to formulate a response or to increase their demands for a rediscovery of local identity. So it's at once a sort of internationalizing phenomenon of greater exchange, inter-urban exchange, and a rediscovery of particular regional or urban identity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So many more questions. Коллеги, пожалуйста, вы можете задавать вопросы нам, спикерам. Для этого можно написать их в чате или подать знак, поднять руку, и мы дадим им возможность задать вопрос голосом. Ага. We have a question in chat. Analyzing the architecture of Sarajevo, as you think when Sarajevo began to realize itself as a separate national region within the framework of Austria-Hungary?
Sorry, Alexander, I only caught the end of the question because I was...
Yeah, when Sarajevo began to realize itself as a separate national region within the framework of Austria-Hungary.
Putting a date to this is difficult because, in fact, Sarajevo and Bosnia-Herzegovina had been an anomaly in the Austro-Hungarian Empire from the moment of its occupation. It was neither part of Austria nor was it part of Hungary. It was administered directly from Vienna and had no, wasn't part of the constitution, had no voting rights. So citizens had been forced into a situation where they had to ask themselves quite actively the question of identity and their relationship towards this large empire from the start of the occupation. What I'm trying to tell is a story of citizens getting quite excited about the possibilities of westernization and of integration into the monarchy, and then gradually a takeover of the more separatist separatist, I'm searching for another word, particular regional identities. And of course, there were people, this had many political expressions. There were people who thought that Bosnia-Herzegovina should be given greater autonomy within the monarchy. And then there were others who thought that it should become part of Serbia. There were some who thought that it should exist as a national entity in its own right. But I think these processes are aided by, or certainly interdependent with, the cultural, architectural movements that I've described. So I would say there's a watershed with 1900.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question. You present, Susan, maybe you could ask the question directly.
Certainly. Thank you, Philip, very much. I love the phrase, by the way, the holy spirit of Western civilization. That's quite a quote. I wondered, you presented the Bosnian style as marking an important shift from a historicizing style of architecture to a modern accommodation of a vernacular architectural tradition. And I wonder if you could clarify or perhaps simply reiterate the difference in the attitudes toward the past, toward the Ottoman architectural past, that you see characterizing each of those styles, or if you will, each phase of that shift. So the kind of attitudes toward the past.
Okay. The one big change is the frame of reference. What models get looked at as an inspiration for this new style? So before, I was talking about these orientalizing buildings that existed in Sarajevo, that were trying to make reference to some kind of Muslim Ottoman past. But if you look at the architects of these buildings, they actually didn't go about Bosnia sketching towns and villages, or indeed Turkish architecture. They looked to Cairo. They looked to the Arab world for inspiration. And so what we have in that first phase is a historicizing style, in my view, that takes a very liberal attitude to its precedents and isn't attached to the region, most importantly. And I think in the quotes that I brought up, we get a sense that there is a new attachment to the soil, as one planner put it, or even Le Corbusier talking about the sort of grown local, regional heritage. And you have these architects who are now going into towns like Yaitse, making these sketches and getting interested in the construction logic as well behind these buildings. It is no longer a facade architecture where you slap on your OG arch or your pointed arch to something that's entirely academy designed, grid based, and the introduction of asymmetry is a big change, a big signifier of that, I believe.
And where, just to follow up on that, this pseudo-Moorish style that you're identifying as historicizing, that's very helpful what you said. Where and when did this pseudo-Moorish style originate? You said, I think you referred to one you referred to the synagogue in St. Petersburg as an example of it, but you're suggesting that it's an international style, and I'm wondering where it comes from.
Okay,
that's sort of when it comes up.
I'll share my screen actually for a second to show you one of the key examples of this orientalizing style in Sarajevo. This is Vijećnica, the town hall, and it's got a magnificent top lit central space, is in many ways reminiscent of some scholars have said shopping arcades of the 19th century, or I brought up synagogues. I'm not an expert on orientalizing styles, and I'm not well placed to answer your question. But in my understanding, orientalizing styles happen across European cities even in the first half of the 19th century. If you look at some of these synagogues. There's been great work on this by a scholar from Vienna called Maximilian Hartmut, who has tried to recover the links between Sarajevan pseudo-Moorish orientalizing architecture and that in the Habsburg monarchy. I know too little about it, but I do believe that it's a pan-European phenomenon.
And academic as well, you suggested.
And academic, yes. If you look at the plan of this building, it could be anything. You know, it could as well have a Ionic facade or a neo-Gothic. That's what the mode of production of this kind of design is very much integrated into European academic tradition. That, of course, ultimately ranges back to the French Revolution and to the academization of architecture and the creation of these art academies across the German-speaking world, certainly.